Hello everybody, it is Train King James back here with yet another tier list for this channel. We have officially completed the first 10 seasons of Thomas, and we have now just finished our longest season yet of the show, of 28 episodes in. You know, I don't want to waste time because I have a lot I want to talk about season 10, but let's get into the episodes. I have the episodes arranged in order, based on the US airing order, and let's get into it. Our first episode of the season is Follow That Flower, and this episode is meh. I will say it's an interesting introduction to the wharf, and I will start with a positive. I kind of like how this is a standard gauge focused story between Thomas and James, yet, you know, it takes place on narrow gauge sets like the wharf, and we get to see a lot more of the wharf scale, you know, Thomas models, which aren't the best, but it is kind of interesting that a lot of this episode is shot with them, when the story could have been shot in a normal standard gauge set. So, for that reason, it's not going to go very low, but I will put it in B tier. It's an okay story. It's not the best, but I do think that that aspect of the story is kind of interesting. But you might notice a particular trend about Season 10 very soon. Next is A Smooth Ride, and this is the reintroduction of Sir Handel to the series, and this one's going in C tier. It's not a bad episode. Well, it's not the greatest. The problem with this episode that I have is I don't agree with the way Sir Handel's characterized. Him being the wise engine, you know, just doesn't really suit his character, doesn't really fit him. I don't know why they made him this way, but lo and behold, here we are. Sir Handel is what he is nowadays, and that's whatever. But yeah, we have Sir Handel being this wise character in an otherwise boring three-strike story. And joining A Smooth Ride in C tier is Thomas and the Jet Plane. Now, a little backstory. As a kid, I was weirdly obsessed with Jeremy. I just really liked the episode. I really wanted to get his model, and, you know, I don't know why. I guess I just really liked planes as a kid. I remember I drew a picture that had a plane on it, and it had like a box in it that had like Jeremy in it, and it's like I was going to get Jeremy, and I really wanted him. Of course, getting a wooden rally Jeremy was complicated, and I actually didn't get one until 2022, but I got a take and play one, which got the job done. But, yeah, this episode it's just kind of a stuff happens story. There's no real character growth. We don't really get to know what Jeremy is like as a person at all. It's just kind of whatever. So, just kind of a whatever story. And we have another hit era story where a character has the boring job and everyone else has the exciting, fun jobs. And at least this time it's with Percy. And it's Percy in the Carnival or Percy in the Fun Fair. It's got the same problems, so I'm going to put it in C tier as well. It's not very good. It's just kind of a bleh episode. Nothing really special. It's nice to see the Chinese dragon again. That's really about it. Then we have The Green Controller, an episode that's weirdly popular, or at least commercially popular, because of, obviously, the Busy as a Bee James, which has been made in several forms of merchandise, but the episode itself is pretty mid. It goes in C tier. Duncan Drops a Clanger is just kind of a weird episode, in my opinion. It's out of character a little bit for Duncan because of weirdly how playful he is. He's not really a playful character. I think they were trying to lean into like his rock and roll identity, but it's not that great an episode. It just feels just kind of silly. I'm going to put it in C tier, but it's not the worst of the season. I'll put it in upper C tier. Thomas's Tricky Tree. So this is kind of a fun episode because it's really the first one in the hit era that really has Thomas involved with working around the narrow gauge engines. Like, he appeared in season 9 with them, but it was mostly just in static shots at the transfer yards. And I think that's why they created the wharf, to kind of create a new environment for Thomas to truly interact with these characters in. But it's just not that great an episode. And it's going in C tier. And you're starting to see a trend here. Next, we have Toby's Afternoon Off. And with this episode, I'm actually going to put this in D tier. And here's why I'm ranking the episode this low. I do not like at all the way Toby is characterized in this episode. Because he's just weirdly selfish, and it's just weirdly out of character for him. And I don't think it's the worst Toby episode of this era, but it's just very poorly written. I mean, Toby's upset because his friends won't help it. He's like, oh, I guess they're not my friends anymore. And then he finds out they're all helping Henry. He's like, oh, well, I'll help you too, Henry. And it's just, I don't know. It's just a very selfish, insecure character that never really was supposed to be that. And I'm starting to really feel that with his character this season. Now, we get a much needed good episode. It's good to be Gordon. Everyone in the fandom praises it. It's a great Gordon and Henry story. Yes, the special cold thing is a little weird, but who cares? It's a good episode overall. I really like their dynamic. I really do like the idea of Gordon giving up on his record. And I really like the ending, too. I like how Thomas brings up, like, well, who has the old record? And it's like, oh yeah, well, Gordon still has that, so he can fall back on that at least. But all in all, just a very strong episode, for this era. And given what came before it, and what will come after it, it was a sorely needed story. Seeing the Sights is another bland, generic 3 Strikes episode. It's just Thomas doing the stupid thing 3 times until finally he realizes that he's being stupid. And I'm just so tired of these types of stories. And it's just bland. There's really nothing all that special about it. Fearless Freddy. Now, this is an episode where I like Fearless Freddy as a character. He's kind of like that old dude that thinks he can still run with the kids and he thinks he can keep up and he's, hip and radical and cool, but he's not. He's kind of past it. I would like this episode so much more if it was about Peter Sam and, Sir Handel, not Scarlo and Rheneas. And again, they're out of character, and it just bothers me when these characters are so badly out of character. It's like, I can't tell what's worse this season. Sir Handel being the old wise engine, or Scarlo and Rheneas being kids. For the most part. We'll get to that part later. But for right now, I am going to put this in B tier because I do really like Freddy's character. But it's close to being C tier. It's not that great. But an episode that will go in C tier is Toby's New Shed. I'm not a fan of this one. I think this story... I don't like Toby's character again. Toby's never really been a shy character. Toby's usually a fairly patient character, but, he will say what he wants to say. In this episode, Thomas is doing something nice for him, and I get what they're trying to do with this story, but it's like, Toby should be able to tell Thomas he doesn't want something, and Thomas listens. It's not like Toby really ever defends himself. He just kind of stands there awkwardly and upset. And I just don't like the way he's characterized here. I will say it's kind of an interesting episode because the main characters, the main engines we see in this are Thomas, Percy, and Toby. Which I think it's one of the first times this era that we really see those 3 characters. Not all together at once, but kind of interacting off of each other. It's kind of interesting. Unfortunately, it's pretty much the only time they do it. Well, one other time this season, but it's not very notable. Big Strong Henry. I go back and forth on this episode. It's a little silly, but I do kind of like this story. Again, it's kind of like a good Gordon-Henry rivalry episode, but I'll put it in B tier. It's not terrible. It's good to be Gordon, but it's a fine story. It's a little better than some of the other episodes this season, but that is not really saying much. And if you notice, I really don't have a lot to say about these episodes, because a lot of them are just kind of mediocre, boring, bland episodes that I don't care about. Moving on. Sticky Toffee Thomas. And this one I'm putting in C tier. It's the second episode of the season, I believe, that features Thomas, Percy, and Toby. I think this was the other one. I don't know, everything runs together, but not really all together. It's mostly Thomas, but they also interact off of him. Mainly because Thomas runs into Toby. But anyway, it's just a boring episode. It's getting hard to kind of really say anything special, because a large chunk of these episodes are not spectacularly bad, but when we get there, we get there. And we'll start with this next one, Which Way Now, which is an episode I kind of forgot about, but I'm putting this in D tier. This is a bad episode for Rusty's character. I mean, this is an episode about Rusty rushing around, not doing his job properly because he wants to do something else. That's not Rusty's characteristic at all. Rusty is known for his patience and attention to care and his duty to his job. That's literally a huge part of his personality and his character, and to, like, not do that is weird. And this whole story is built around it. This would be a much better story for Peter Sam, who is pretty much the only narrow gauge engine to not get an episode this season. But yeah, it's just not a great story that features Rusty at all. I don't know. It just doesn't... It's not really all that special. Thomas and the Shooting Star is bland, generic, boring. Hold on, if I can actually grab the episode. Here we go. Yeah. Alright. We're just going to put this in F tier. I don't really want to spend a lot of time explaining why this episode sucks. But this episode really sucks because of another episode this season that I really love. And I'm going to, I don't want to put too much energy into hating this episode because everyone knows why this episode sucks. This episode could borderline be sued for defamation of Edward's character. And the fact that there's 2 episodes this season that focus around Edward. One where he's used really well and one where he's used really poorly is so disappointing. It is so disappointing. Then you have Topped Off Thomas. This episode sucks. It's stupid, it's dumb. It's just not a great story. Like, at all. I feel like I'm flying through this, but it's like I really don't have anything to say about these episodes. I mean, a lot of them are just bland and bad stories. The story does not make sense, because the Fat Controller gets mad at Thomas for rushing through a station, which knocks off his hat. Which, that's not really Thomas's fault. It's windy. You're probably going to lose your hat anyway. And then, like, the next scene, and the funniest thing about it is I thought, well, Gordon speeds through... Whoops, hit my computer. Gordon speeds through stations, and he's, he doesn't get scolded for it. Like, what if Gordon had come through? And literally the next scene, Thomas is at Maithwaite and Gordon comes flying through. Why Gordon's at Maithwaite, I don't know. That's the hit error thing for you. But he flies through the station, and it's like, well, Gordon can do it. It's fine. But when Thomas does it, it's a problem. It's just, I don't know. It's a stupid thing. I do kind of like seeing Spencer again, which is why I don't completely hate this episode. But the story is so stupid that, I have to put it in D tier. But it is interesting that you can argue the Thomas and Spencer rivalry kind of starts here. Something that carries over into the next season and even into Hero of the Rails. I don't know why more people do not talk about this episode being terrible. Wharf in Peace is awful, and it's a bad Skarloey episode. I would argue it's even worse than Skarloey the Brave. Because this episode is almost like a giant retcon to everything about Skarloey's character. And the thing about this episode that frustrates me is this would work perfectly for a new narrow gauge character. Skarloey is scared of the Wharf because he's scared of all the big engines and he doesn't want to embarrass himself. And I'm like, you know these engines, you know James, you know Thomas, like, you know these characters. This is a frustrating episode. It's like, why is this the one, like, I don't know. These episodes are weird. And maybe seasonal order is a thing, because I don't know if you guys noticed, but I watch in the US order. That's the playlist in the drive that I watch. It's pretty much the order of the US airings, which is interesting because you get cases like in Big Strong Henry, Rocky appears, but then Edward Strikes Out comes out after it. But in this episode, it's like, is this supposed to be the introductory to the Wharf episode? I don't know. It's still weird. Like, this is a bad episode for Skarloey. And the thing is, that frustrates me. Rheneas is actually characterized fairly well, and he is in another episode that I'm going to bring up in a bit. But this episode, Rheneas is characterized well. He's fairly wise. He gives Skarloey advice. He's pretty well in character here. So it shows they can do it. They refuse to do it consistently. But I digress. Skarloey, terribly out of character. This would have worked so much better for a new character. Like, imagine Luke writing the story in CGI about Luke going to, like, the Wharf. I could see that working. It would be so much better for him than it works for Skarloey. I don't need to talk about this episode. If you saw my How I'd Fix the Hit Era video, this was the other Season 10 episode from that made it. This episode sucks. It's stupid. Edward Strikes Out is worse, but they're both bad. So we have gone roughly 20 episodes into this season. We have one S-tier episode, a load of C-tier episodes, and a lot of D's and F's. But now let's get into something that's better. Emily and the Special Coaches is an A-tier episode. It's a really good Emily and Diesel story. It's a nice pairing. A pairing we really haven't seen to this point in the show. I was really disappointed with how Diesel and the other Diesel engines were used in Season 9, coming off the heels of Calling All Engines. This episode, though, I think feels better. Diesel is treated more sympathetically, and while he's still a trickster, he's actually not a bad character all in all. I think that, you understand why he does what he does. So it's not just like, oh, stupid, stinky steamies. He does his thing because, Emily wrongs him, and she kind of deserves a little bit of a criticism. But yeah, really strong story about Emily and Diesel. I do like how it's solved at the end. I do like the overall solution. Really solid entry. Next, we get Thomas and the Colors. Another really good episode. Back-to-back good episodes this season. It might be the first time that's happened. But, yeah, I like the Thomas and James rivalry, which appears a couple times this season. It's a much stronger episode than Follow That Flower. I think it's a pretty fun story. I like that Thomas tries to play into James's weaknesses and his ego, talk about oh, well, the flags and stripes block your block your red paint. I kind of like that. It shows that Thomas really tries to knows how to get under James's skin. While, these two have this kind of competitive, sibling, almost rivalry type relationship with each other. And they work really well off each other as characters. I like the solution. It's actually pretty creative. So it's a pretty strong episode this season. Thomas and the Birthday Mail is okay. It's not the worst episode of the season. I'm putting it in B tier. I do kind of like Rosie. Whenever I thought back on this episode, I always thought, is this kind of like a weird thing that, you have this female character chasing around a male character that has this, immense interest in him? But rewatching it this time, it's definitely supposed to be, younger sibling that follows around the older sibling and never leaves the older sibling alone. It's actually a really, when you put it in that lens, the story kind of works a lot more strongly, and I kind of like it more, and it gave me a new appreciation for it. It's a fun episode. It's nice. I think it's one of the better hit era introductions to a character. Gave her a strong personality, and that's why Rosie tended to stay around. Keeping up with these pretty strong episodes, we get Duncan's Bluff, which is the second S-tier episode of the season. Really, really good episode. Really strong story. Really not much else to say. It's a really good James and Duncan story, which is a fun pairing that we haven't seen since Season 4, I believe. Obviously, I love the idea that, hey, we could have just brought Percy in to do the Narragage episodes, but I like that they picked James, the other primary character of the show at the point, because they used to heavily market Thomas, Percy, and James. So it's okay, Thomas and Percy have the pack, Thomas and James have the Narragage engines, and I like that. It creates interesting dynamics beyond what we're used to seeing, and I kind of like that. And this episode takes full advantage of that. It's really the first time James gets to truly shine with the Narragage engines. It was mostly him with Thomas and the Narragage engines to this point. Now it's he gets a true episode with them. This is an episode on my rewatch that actually kind of shocked me. I was kind of shocked by how good this episode is. It's an episode that stars Rhaenyra in the hit era that actually is really well in character. Skarloey's tired and Rhaenyra wants to help him out, and he does that, but it leads to a little bit of a misunderstanding. The episode is really well paced. It doesn't have 3 strikes in it. It doesn't have a lot of just continually hey, we know how this is going to turn out. I like how it uses the characters. It gives Peter Sam a solid role. I'm not sure why he was kind of pushed to the side so much this season. He only gets a couple minor appearances, but here is a pretty nice role. It's a really good character episode for Rhaenyra. I could see this episode happening. This doesn't feel like one that's oh, well, if this episode takes place in season, if this episode, like, you could take it back in the past, like, to Rhaenyra's youth. Like, no. This episode works now. Like, this is a really good Rhaenyra story for right now. And that's something you don't typically get in this era. So, A tier, and a surprising one at that. Thomas and the Treasure is just kind of a mid-episode. Nothing special. Nothing really interesting. I will say, watching this episode, I remember watching Unlucky Tug's Season 10 retrospective, and a big comment he had about the season was, the overuse of just kind of bland set design and making sets just to fill stories and not making sets that feel realistic to Sodor, and this episode felt like that. And it's just not very interesting, it's very repetitive, very boring. It's not bad, but it ain't good. Our last two episodes, though, I like very much. And we'll start with what I think is my favorite episode of this season. And it could be my favorite of the hitter, or it's between that one and Respect for Gordon. But James the Second Best. I don't think I'm speaking in hyperbole here. I think this is one of the best Edward episodes of the show. Not the best Edward episode of the hit era. I mean, yes, it is. But I think it's the best Edward episode of the show. And I've really wanted to dive in and talk more about this episode, so if you guys are interested to hear my thoughts, comment below if you'd like to hear me talk about it more. But I love the way this episode characterizes Edward. And it's so interesting that my favorite episode and my least favorite episode of this season literally feature the same character. I don't know how you can badly mistreat a character that you can literally one day write him one of the best stories he's ever had, and then also write one of the worst. And it's a story about James kind of figuring out why Edward's better than him, and he's kind of coming to terms with that. And it's a frustrating story for James, but nonetheless, he does, when he realizes it and understands it, but I think it leads to kind of an interesting conversation about Edward. And I like the idea that Edward is the poster engine, which may be a metaphor for Edward being the poster child, similar to like last season how Percy was the spirit of Sodor. They could have very easily made this episode about Thomas, and I think this episode would have worked fine, especially considering we had kind of like a couple James and Thomas rivalry episodes earlier this season. But no, everyone's like, yeah, Edward's the poster engine, and he deserves it. And James, the entire episode, he could go about this a completely different way, where, he gets angry and he doubles down on what he does, but no, he tries as hard as he can to be like Edward, and it doesn't work. And I'd love to discuss more about this episode. I think this is a really, really interesting episode I could really dive into. If you're really interested to hear my full thoughts, comment, and I'll make a video. And our last episode this season is a nice, solid ending to what was pretty much a mediocre season. Thomas and Skarloey's Big Day Out is a really fun, really technically well-shot episode. And what I mean by that is the episode constantly goes between, traditional Gauge 1 sets and then Gauge 3 sets to accommodate Wharf Scale Thomas and obviously Gauge 1 Skarloey. And it's a fun episode because we get to see Skarloey's Season 4 prop again, but we also just, there's so many times where the sets go back and forth, and it's like, okay, which one is which? Is this, normal Thomas? Is this Wharf Scale Thomas? Is this normal Skarloey? Is this Wharf Scale Skarloey? Or Gauge 1 Skarloey, whatever you want to call it. It's so fun to kind of go back between it. And it's similar to Follow That Flower, where you have a standard gauge episode primarily taking place on narrow gauge sets. Now you have a narrow gauge episode, technically featuring Skarloey, on standard gauge sets. And it's kind of fun seeing Skarloey on Gordon's Hill, seeing Skarloey by the Scottish Castle, seeing Skarloey on standard gauge sets. And I think that's kind of a fun idea. It's a really fun kind of buddy travel adventure episode. And with that ends Season 10, which probably is the most negative season I've had so far. I mean, we had 6 episodes in six episodes in D and F tier. Majority of the season ends up in C tier, and not a lot of great episodes. I mean, really, the best episodes of the season are the top 7. I think you could go without watching anything below A tier. But, yeah, that's the kind of season the season produced, and for one that had more episodes, I could feel like the season really could have done without a couple of them. Hintity hint hint. Anyways, this is Train King James signing off with yet again another tier list. Bye, y'all.